Welcome to the Harber Show. My guest today is Jorge Guajardo, the former Mexican ambassador to China. Jorge, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, it's an honor to have you on the show. Of course, you're also with McLarty Associates now.
I am in Washington, D.C.
With Mac and all of his shenanigans, as it were.
That's right.
So tell me how you think the world sees America today. It's not that it's a monolithic view, of course, but give me your sense.
As more unpredictable, more unreliable, still the aspirational country. The United States still has a lot of things the world aspires to. It's still a very attractive destination for immigrants, those who can come in. But it's seen perhaps less as a moral leader than it used to, but still as an economic power that most countries seek to access its markets. It's, I guess, complicated as it is for the United States to realize how things are evolving, but it is changing. I would say the world's impression of the United States is changing day by day.
In a positive or negative way?
I would say mostly negative. I try to think positive. I'd have a harder time coming up with. So again, things that we had grown used to as a Mexican, you'd look up to the United States for many things. First of all, for its democracy, for its rule of law, for its freedoms, for its freedom of speech, for its free press. Those were all aspirational things in our countries. We would always want it to be like the United States. Many of those things are now being questioned in the United States. The press is under attack by the president, so we don't see the freedom of press, even though it still exists. It's not a given the way it used to be. Liberty probably is not taken for what it is when you see the detention centers that have been sprouting up in the past in the United States. So those are issues that the world is taking into consideration. And perhaps I would also say the unreliability of being a partner with the United States. I think everybody who had, or every country that had been a partner to the United States has now got to question how solid that partnership is. So those are things that are changing.
All right, significant. What about the U.S. and Mexico? What does each country need to do to strengthen, to improve the relationship?
So I think the Mexico-U.S. relationship was already very strong. We cooperate and collaborate on many issues. So we have the North American Free Trade Agreement that has joined Mexico, the United States, and Canada for the past 25 years, and that has been a very strong foundation to base our relationship on. But we have many other areas of cooperation. We cooperate on immigration, we cooperate on climate, we cooperate on pandemics, on labor. I mean, there are so many issues in which we cooperate that I would venture to say the relationship between Mexico and the United States is a good one and it's a strong one. The question is, what do we do not to ruin that or not to make it any worse or not to make it worse? And that's where the challenges have been. And mind you, those are challenges that are valid. I mean, the immigration issue is a valid issue for the United States. I understand it's a concern. When you see many people show up at the border, evidently those are one of the areas in which Mexico and the United States need to cooperate and make sure that we are good neighbors. In the process of cooperation, one would hope that it be done in good terms, not by threats. So those are issues that might get in the way of a good relationship.
What do you think the American people should know about the Mexican people that we don't know?
Okay, that's a very good question. Perhaps one of the things that few American people understand about Mexico is that Mexican, for 70 years, we had a one-party system that was based in big part in nationalism and anti-U.S. rhetoric. The U.S. was the source of all our ills, stole half of our territory, So for many years, we were brought up in anti-U.S. rhetoric, and that has changed. And it has been a slow change. And we've been, for the past 25 years, talking in Mexico about our U.S. being our partner, not our adversary. And that's a big change, but it's not a solid one. That is to say, it's something we have to build towards on a daily basis. It's not granted, and it's something that we can very easily backtrack into our nationalist roots because they go deep in Mexico. And that's something that I would, in my appreciation, many Americans don't know about Mexico.
How about the Mexican government? What don't the American people know about the Mexican government that we should know? Because I mean, the stories, of course, we see an incredible amount of news about corruption, about crime. What's happening that we should know about?
There is a lot of corruption in Mexico, and there is crime in Mexico. I would say the Mexican government is not a central government in the sense that it doesn't all emanate from the presidency. There are state governorships, there are municipalities. A lot of these things happen at that level. So in the US, the tendency is to look at the head of the government, the president of Mexico, and assume that everything emanates from him, and they have all been men, so I will refer to him in the past as him. And much of the problems we face in Mexico are at the state and municipal level that tend to be more complicated to address, but we are trying to address them. And I think democracy has helped in that sense.
What is the challenge of the drug wars, the drug cartels? You have this extraordinary demand for drugs in the United States, which has had a horrific effect in Mexico. Over 100,000 people murdered as a result of all this activity. What can each side do to address that?
Well, obviously the easy answer is to address demand, but that's much more complicated than it sounds. Mexicans think that an easy solution would be address the supply of guns. More than 90% of the crimes committed in Mexico, or the homicides committed in Mexico, are committed with arms imported from the United States. And arms are illegal in Mexico, guns are illegal in Mexico, and we believe that if the U.S. helped stem the flow of guns, the fight against organized crime would be an easier fight.
How could the U.S. do that?
That's a good question for you to ask the American people, but one that most of the world sees the United States and wonders why there is this free flow of guns that, in the case of Mexico, have very direct consequences. Also in the case of the United States, but I'm speaking for Mexico now.
Well, and it's a challenge when I think the American people really don't realize that it's our demand that's causing the problem, our demand for drugs, and our supplying guns that results in the loss of so many lives in Mexico. And that's something that we have not taken responsibility for here in the United States.
Well, simple economics tells you that when there is a demand, there will be a supply. And yes, drug trade or the organized crime behind drug trade does follow a demand. So before there used to be, the supply came from Colombia. And you'll remember in the 80s, the Miami Vice theme and how there was that route coming in from Colombia through the Florida Keys. And the U.S. very clearly addressed that issue, and all it did was shift the supply from Colombia, from the Andes, to Mexico. Now, if you go after the Mexican supply, you will shift it to China with the methamphetamines. As long as there is a demand, there will be a supply.
All right, fair enough. We're going to take a break. We will be back with the ambassador in just a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
The Rexall Broadcaster of the Year Award recognizes an individual who, through leadership, skill, and dedication, is advancing the broadcast industry in our state and our nation. Tonight, we honor Aaron Harber. Aaron has worked extensively in the media as a host, producer, political and economic commentator, and columnist. Today, the Aaron Harber Show is the focus of his media involvement. Aaron, it is a privilege to present you with the Rexall Broadcaster of the Year Award. Congratulations.
just make journalism great again.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the show. I'm with Ambassador Jorge Guajardo. So in your role as an ambassador, I know you're always a terribly diplomatic person, but you have a president here in the United States that's constantly threatening Mexico. How do you set policy in Mexico? Every other week the president is threatening Mexico with new tariffs in an effort to stem the flow of immigrants. Is that an effective approach? And what can Mexico really do?
Okay, so whether it's an effective approach or not, I don't know. It has worked evidently in the past. I think that it's an approach that can be overused. I compare it to the overprescription of antibiotics. They might make you feel good once, maybe twice, do it too much, and they lose all efficiency. And the same happens with the president's continuous threats on Mexico or the rest of the world, for that matter, to hit other countries with tariffs. Yes, they get you to act at first. No, eventually you say, listen, he'll continue to do this. There is no point in responding. So I'll give you an example. He was elected on the platform that he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. And renegotiate NAFTA he did. We had the USMCA that was signed in by the three presidents, two presidents and the Prime Minister of Canada in Buenos Aires. So you have an USMCA, Mexico made concessions, the US made demands, so on and so forth. You have an agreement. It was the only agreement he had so far negotiated. And then comes this threat to impose tariffs after you had negotiated the agreement. So you have to wonder if you're Mexico, but let alone Mexico, if you're China, the EU, Japan, all these other countries that have to come into negotiations with the United States that he's threatening with. He's threatening the EU or Japan with auto tariffs with 232 provision. He's threatening China. Eventually you have to realize, seeing Mexico, that it doesn't matter what concessions you make or what negotiations or agreements you make, you will always be in the crosshairs. Even though Mexico had signed an agreement, he still proceeded to threaten with imposing blanket tariffs. So yes, they had an effect. Eventually, I think it wears out, and other countries just realize that there's no point in responding, since he will continue doing it.
Is the new agreement, of course, it has not been ratified yet. Is it really that much different from NAFTA, and if so, how?
It's not much difference, but it does modernize NAFTA. So it brings in e-commerce, for instance. It brings biologics, some things on rules of origin for the auto industry. It tweaks along the margins, and it somewhat improves it. It has been ratified by Mexico, not in the United States or Canada.
So do you think it disadvantages Mexico at all? Or what has Mexico gained from it?
Okay, probably hasn't gained much, hasn't lost much either. I would say the status quo remains, and the status quo is good, and it's good for all three countries.
If Democrats in the U.S. Senate require some tougher regulations regarding to labor laws in Mexico, environmental laws, do you see Mexico agreeing to those kinds of changes?
So I think that their demands would be more on the enforcement side. So Mexico already passed a labor law, and the question is how will it be enforced? And I think Mexico will cooperate with the United States to give them peace of mind that Mexico is serious about its labor reforms. On environment, the same. In fact, I think Mexico is much more progressive on environment than the United States. If for no other reason, we are part of the Paris Agreement, which the U.S. is not. So we're okay with environmental issues, and I think, as good partners do, Mexico will find ways to make sure that the U.S. Congress feels at ease with ratifying this trade agreement.
One of the things that Trump is doing on the trade front is he's weaponizing the U.S. dollar, using it to go after both countries, individuals, companies, organizations that he feels are damaging the U.S. He's doing that with Iran, of course. But when he does that, what kind of effects does he have? What will other countries think, especially in terms of the U.S. dollar being the world's reserve currency, if it's going to be used in such a political fashion?
So it has an immediate impact that requires every country to react, because we are caught off guard. We never thought the U.S. would weaponize this, and here we are. So evidently you have to react, not to be cut out. But I would not be surprised if the world is looking for options going forward, not to be put in this place again. So that's why I say, yes, in the short term, President Trump's tactics work, but I think in the medium and long term, they debilitate the U.S.'s negotiating power going forward.
If the U.S., in that vein, if the U.S. loses power over time, and certainly the ascendancy of China, and we still need to talk about China, continues to occur, how does a weaker U.S. affect Mexico?
So it's all about markets in this case, for the case for Mexico. So Mexico has, the U.S. is the most attractive market for the world, make no mistake. It is the most attractive market in the world, which is what President Trump in essence has been weaponizing. He knows it, he's been weaponizing access to that market, and it's been working for him. So in that sense, as long as Mexico keeps access to that market, we'll be in a good place. We will start looking most probably for other countries, not necessarily to China, for moral authority, or countries that we seek to emulate when it comes to democracy, when it comes to rule of law, when it comes to transparency, issues that developing countries aspire to. We used to look to the United States for that. Perhaps we'll be looking to the European Union more and more.
We've talked a little bit about China. China has its Belt and Road initiative, which has allowed it to really be involved and ingrain itself in a number of countries around the world. A number of those countries are finding they are accumulating great debt, financial debt to China as part of the arrangements that were made. Is Mexico involved in the Belt and Road initiative at all?
No, we're not involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, and I think that's a good thing, and I hope we never get involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. I am not as optimistic on the Belt and Road Initiative. I do not believe it has a positive effect. And on the other hand, I don't think it's something the U.S. should be worrying about. This is not a Chinese influence the U.S. needs to counter. You just need China to do its thing, and other countries will find out that China is not a good partner, and they will walk away on their own.
All right. We're going to take our last break. We'll be back with the ambassador in just a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email harbertv.com.
Safely stop fires around your home. Introducing the Fire Ice XT 20-ounce aerosol canister. Fire Ice XT is an eco-friendly water-based fire suppressant gel. Unlike a traditional fire extinguisher, Fire Ice XT is a highly effective, non-toxic firefighting agent that is easy and safe to use around your home, family, and pets. Available at Amazon.com or call 800-924-4874.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. And tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to aaron@harbertv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
Welcome back to the show. I am with Ambassador Jorge Guajardo. So one of the interesting aspects of U.S. policy has been this effort to ban Huawei. the Chinese telecommunications giant. And the concern that's been articulated is that within its products, the company at the Chinese government's alleged insistence has embedded technology which will allow it to spy on different countries, to gather data from different systems that it should not be allowed to do. The company has denied all of these accusations, but the U.S. has banned their equipment and has put a lot of countries under pressure to do the same. And many countries have resisted that pressure. What is Mexico's position?
So that's a very good question, because there used to be an unwritten understanding between Mexico and the United States that Mexico would not allow Huawei to develop its telecommunications infrastructure. Again, it was an unwritten understanding, and that changed with President Trump. When President Trump started launching all the attacks on Mexico and sort of breaking all the other areas of cooperation, Mexico said, there's no point in trying to please the United States on the Huawei issue, so we might as well just go for the best, cheapest alternative, which is Huawei. And the fact is, Huawei is very much involved now in Mexico's telecommunications infrastructure.
So that's really interesting that Trump's policies had the opposite effect.
They might just have had the same effect with the European Union. Most European countries were already wary of China and wary of Huawei. But of course, in comes President Trump with threats that these countries will be cut off. And now, of course, these presidents fear, or prime ministers or premiers, fear looking weak or caving to the United States with their own people. And remember, every president has a base. Every foreign president has a base. It's not just President Trump who has a base. Every foreign leader has a base. And most foreign bases hate placating President Trump. So even if they were already predisposed to sort of agree with the United States on the Huawei issue, now, of course, they're saying, well, it's more complicated. Let's make sure we look into it. And that's where we are.
Are you concerned at all when you look at the trade disputes between the U.S. and Mexico, which seem to ebb and flow depending on what the president had for breakfast or lunch, but have the potential to really become very serious, as well as certainly the trade disputes with China, which certainly have the potential to become even far more serious? Could those disputes result or seriously contribute to a global recession? Or do you think the numbers are such that that's really unlikely to happen?
Let me just start by separating both trade disputes. I believe the trade dispute with China is very much warranted. And you heard me right. I think President Trump does well to confront China on its unfair trade practices. I think the case with Mexico is much different. Mind you, I'm Mexican, of course, but I think Mexico is not being accused of gaming the system. We never game the system. We play by the rules that we signed and agreed to. China does not. China does game the system, and China does need to be confronted. Will that lead to a world recession? My initial thought would say no. Trade is only along the margins. It won't lead to recession. However, facts seem to point the other way. Apparently, the uncertainty this has created has sort of made industry to hold its pocket and said, maybe this is not the best time to invest, maybe this is a time and that, of course, has other effects which might lead to recession.
So President Trump also has described climate change as a hoax. I'd be interested in Mexico's take on it, and what is Mexico doing to address climate change?
So Mexico has
You mentioned, of course, still in the Paris Accords.
Mexico has been actually in the forefront of climate change talks. We hosted the climate change talks, the COP16 in Cancun in 2009, I believe, and we are a country that's committed to moving to renewable energies, and we have certain deadlines that we're trying to meet. So Mexico takes climate change very seriously. We remain within the Paris Accords, which most of the world does in any case. And we see with concern how the U.S. would be retreating in that area, which again is one of the areas in which the world tended to look up to the United States for setting the example, and now we have to look somewhere else.
Well, and the United States isn't technically out of the Paris Accords yet, but it's on the path.
Well, the thing here is the technicalities don't matter because nobody understands the technicalities. It's the narrative, the rhetoric that matters. It's the fact that climate change is denied as a hoax. It's the fact that President Trump comes out in the Rose Garden and has a party with jazz bands to announce the U.S. exiting the Paris Accord. And that sort of sends a very strong signal that the United States is not on board on this important issue. Okay,
since you were the Mexican ambassador to China, I do want to ask you a few questions. China has developed into this, is heading towards the world's largest authoritarian country in the world. What's your perspective on that? The level of surveillance now in China and how that's growing, the control of the internet, what Chinese citizens have access to. Be interested in your thoughts on all those and your thoughts about what do the Chinese people think about all this?
Okay, I'll start with the second part because other than the Uyghur population, which of course has been targeted in a cruel and unfair way, I would say most of the Chinese population don't necessarily feel targeted by this surveillance state. And I'm not sure the United States or many other countries are altogether innocent of it. You have surveillance everywhere. We just think that China, because it's an authoritarian country, they use that surveillance for evil purposes, whereas the U.S. does it
to fight crime.
To fight crime, of course, and promote democracy and freedom. And that's not necessarily the case in China or the United States. So I tend to be a bit of a skeptic of that narrative of China being an authoritarian government based on surveillance. A lot of it is hype. You have, like for instance, these cameras, Hikvision, and all these cameras they're setting up. Turns out that only about 10% have the AI capability to actually have facial recognition, and those that do have a failure rate of up to 30%. So it's not what it's made out to be. Nevertheless, it's worrisome. It's worrisome because AI and surveillance is something that authoritarian governments can easily use to their advantage to control populations. Will the populations let themselves be controlled? I don't know. In the case of Hong Kong, they haven't. And I think every government, authoritarian or democratic, has to tread carefully in that area.
And what about the Chinese people? Because you were in China, what's your sense of their level of satisfaction, how they look to the future?
I think they are not as concerned about the surveillance state. I think they were optimistic in general about the future. That has changed, particularly when Xi Jinping did away with his re-election. It's weird. One wouldn't assume that would have such a big effect, but it did have an effect on the Chinese people. The economy has been going down. He's sort of been cracking down on liberties. And I think right now, I would venture to say there is unease, whatever that is, amongst the Chinese population. Mind you, China is a big country, 1.4 billion people. It's hard to speak for 1.4 billion people, but I think there is more unease now than there was 12 years ago or 10 years ago. How will they channel that uneasiness, or how will the government control it or tame it? It's still to be seen.
All right, very interesting observation about the elimination of term limits and having that significant a psychological effect. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to come join your show.
So that was the former Mexican ambassador to China. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.